Tonight, before we sleep, we enter the rooms where history changed forever, rooms lit by candlelight, by cigar smoke, by trembling lamps in wartime Washington. Inside them sat presidents, some exhausted, some terrified, some proud, some dangerously certain, and with the stroke of a pen, they could send thousands of young men across oceans, into forests, into trenches, into fire. War is never just strategy. It is mothers waiting beside silent windows. It is fathers unfolding telegrams with shaking hands. It is children growing older without ever hearing a familiar voice again. Yet, throughout American history, presidents again and again chose war. Sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of ambition. And slowly, almost quietly, America drifted away from the dream of its founders, a dream that no single leader should ever possess the power to drag a nation into bloodshed alone. Tonight's story is about those decisions, the wars that shaped America, the men who justified them, and the terrible distance between patriotism and power. But before we begin our journey into these long shadows of history, if these quiet late-night stories help you slow down, think deeply, or fall asleep beneath the weight of forgotten history, consider subscribing. And if tonight's story stays with you after the screen fades to black, share it with someone else who still believes history matters. Now, dim the lights and let us wander backward through the long corridors of American war. The year was 1807. America was still young, fragile, uncertain. The scars of the Revolutionary War had not yet faded from memory. Then, one summer day, the British warship HMS Leopard intercepted an American vessel called the USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia. The British demanded to search the ship for deserters. The Americans refused. Cannons erupted across the water. Smoke swallowed the sea. When the gunfire ended, American sailors lay dead. Across the United States, rage spread like wildfire. Newspapers screamed for revenge. Crowds demanded war against Britain. Many believed America's honor had been insulted. But President Thomas Jefferson sat quietly in the storm. He understood something most leaders forget. A nation angry for a week may suffer for generations. Jefferson hated war, not because he was weak, but because he understood its appetite. War devoured money, war devoured sons, war devoured freedom itself. And deep down, Jefferson knew America might lose. The British Navy ruled the oceans. America was not ready. So instead of rushing into battle, Jefferson stalled. He sent diplomats across the Atlantic. He delayed Congress. He waited for tempers to cool, while newspapers shouted for blood. Jefferson chose patience. Months later, Britain agreed to concessions, and war faded away. No victory parades followed, no heroic paintings, only silence. But perhaps silence was the greatest victory of all. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, inherited a different America, one filled with wounded pride. British ships continued seizing American sailors, American trade suffered, and in Congress, new voices rose. Young politicians called themselves the war hawks. They spoke of honor, glory, national pride. Among them stood Henry Clay of Kentucky, fiery and relentless. To him, peace looked like weakness. War looked like destiny. Madison hesitated, but hesitation in politics often becomes its own kind of danger. Soon newspapers mocked him, politicians attacked him, and the pressure grew unbearable. Finally, in 1812, America declared war on Britain. The results were disastrous. American invasions failed. British troops marched into Washington. The White House burned beneath the night sky. And yet somehow, exhausted and bruised, America survived. But the lesson remained. Sometimes nations drift into war not because they must, but because pride refuses to remain still. If Jefferson feared war, President James Polk desired it. He believed in something called manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to spread across the continent. To Polk, expansion was not greed, it was divine permission. But Mexico stood in the way, and Americans would never support naked conquest. So Polk needed something else, a spark, a provocation. He moved American troops into disputed territory near the Rio Grande. Cannons pointed toward Mexican towns. Tension thickened in the desert air. Then violence erupted. Mexican forces attacked an American patrol. Suddenly, Polk stood before Congress declaring American blood had been shed. War was approved, but behind the speeches about defense and patriotism lay another truth. Polk had engineered the conditions for conflict, and when the war ended, America seized enormous territories: California, Arizona, New Mexico, vast lands purchased with blood. Thousands died, and the United States expanded by more than 1 million square miles. For some Americans, it was triumph. For others, it was the moment ambition learned how easily fear could be manipulated. Then came Abraham Lincoln, a nation divided against itself, North against South, brother against brother. The Civil War would become the deadliest conflict in American history. Lincoln did not want war, but the Union was collapsing. Southern states declared themselves independent. Forts were seized. Voices demanded violence. So Lincoln prepared for war without officially declaring one, because to declare war would mean recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. Instead, he called them rebels. And while history remembers Lincoln as the great emancipator, war transformed him. Civil liberties were suspended. People could be imprisoned without trial. Military rule spread through troubled regions. Lincoln believed extraordinary danger required extraordinary power, and perhaps he was right. Or perhaps every wartime leader believes that, still. Lincoln carried something rare, a moral vision beyond victory. Eventually, the war became not just about preserving the Union, but ending slavery itself. And through unimaginable suffering, America emerged transformed, but at a terrible cost. More than 620,000 dead. A generation buried beneath battlefield soil. In 1898, another explosion changed history. The USS Maine sat anchored in Havana Harbor, Cuba. Then suddenly, a blast tore through the ship. Metal twisted. Fire consumed the darkness. More than 260 Americans died. Newspapers exploded with fury. Remember the Maine? War fever swept the country. President William McKinley hesitated at first, but pressure mounted. Soon America went to war with Spain, and something strange happened. The mission expanded. What began as liberation became empire. The United States seized territories across the globe: the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii. America was no longer simply a republic. It was becoming a world power. Years later, investigators concluded the Maine likely exploded because of an internal accident, not a Spanish attack. But by then, history had already changed course. When World War I erupted in Europe, President Woodrow Wilson promised neutrality. He told Americans to remain calm, to stay peaceful. But war has gravity, and eventually it pulls nations toward it. German submarines attacked civilian ships. Americans died. Then came the Zimmermann telegram. Germany secretly encouraged Mexico to attack the United States. Now war became unavoidable. Wilson declared America would fight to make the world safe for democracy. But even idealists can become harsh in wartime. Critics were punished. Government loyalty tests appeared. Fear spread quietly beneath patriotic speeches. And after the war ended, Wilson dreamed of a League of Nations that would prevent future wars forever. But Americans distrusted international power. The Senate rejected it. Wilson's great vision collapsed, and the world drifted toward another catastrophe. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Smoke rising over shattered battleships. Thousands dead. America shocked awake. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a date which would live in infamy. And yet, some historians believe Roosevelt understood danger was approaching long before the attack. American codebreakers had intercepted alarming Japanese communications. Warnings existed, questions lingered. Still, after Pearl Harbor, America entered World War II. Unlike many wars before it, this conflict carried undeniable moral clarity. Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, mass murder, aggression, totalitarianism. Roosevelt became a voice of endurance. His speeches steadied frightened citizens, but even great leaders carry stains. Under Roosevelt, Japanese-American families were forced into internment camps, citizens treated as enemies because of ancestry. Fear had once again overpowered liberty. In 1950, war erupted in Korea. North invaded South. President Harry Truman entered the conflict under the banner of the United Nations, but the war spiraled dangerously. General Douglas MacArthur pushed deeper toward China. Then Chinese forces entered the war. The world stood near catastrophe. MacArthur demanded escalation. Some feared nuclear war itself. Truman faced a terrible choice: support his celebrated general or stop him. He fired MacArthur. Many Americans were furious. But Truman believed civilian leaders, not generals, must control war. Because once military ambition escapes restraint, the fire becomes impossible to contain. Then came Vietnam, a war born from uncertainty, from fear, from blurred truths. In 1964, reports claimed North Vietnamese forces attacked an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. Then came reports of a second attack, but confusion spread. Evidence was weak. Some officers doubted the attack happened at all. President Lyndon Johnson moved forward anyway. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a blank check for war. Soon thousands of American soldiers entered Vietnam. Jungles burned, villages vanished, young men died far from home. Nearly 60,000 Americans would never return, and all of it resting partly upon an event that may never have happened. Yet even Johnson drew one line. When military leaders considered nuclear weapons, he refused. Somewhere beneath the chaos, humanity still survived. Barely. Long before these wars, America's founders feared kings. They feared powerful leaders dragging nations into endless conflict. So they designed a system. Only Congress could declare war. Power would be divided, balanced, restrained. But over centuries, Presidents learned how to bend the system. Some manipulated fear, some used emergencies, some bypassed Congress entirely. Slowly, war-making power drifted towards a presidency. And perhaps that is the true story tonight, not simply wars themselves, but how fear reshapes democracy, how emergencies expand authority, how liberty retreats one crisis at a time. Now the night grows quiet, the presidents are gone. Their wars have faded into textbooks, memorials, graveyards. But their questions remain. When is war necessary? When does defense become ambition? How much power should one leader possess? And how many lives can be sacrificed in the name of security, honor, or destiny? History offers no perfect answers. Only warnings. Warnings written in smoke, in ruined cities, in folded flags, handed to grieving families. Perhaps the greatest leaders are not those who win wars, but those who resist them. And perhaps peace, the fragile, difficult art of restraint, is the rarest courage of all. Good night.